Greetings, folks, and welcome to another edition of History Up Close, brought to you by the Naval Aviation Museum Foundation and produced by Hellcat Productions. We're very excited about today's topic, as today, 4 June, represents the 78th anniversary of the Battle of Midway. There were larger battles with greater bloodshed, but no battle held more in the balance for our great country. As many of you are aware, we here in Pensacola are proud to hold the last remaining surviving airplane to have flown in that epic battle, the SBD Dauntless that you see behind me. We're fortunate to have with us our resident expert on that battle and our historian, Hill Goodspeed, to tell us about this remarkable airplane, this remarkable battle, and this remarkable story. Hill, take it away.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Captain Gillum, and welcome Facebook fans to the latest iteration of our Facebook Live programs here from the National Naval Aviation Museum. And it's a real pleasure for me to talk about the aircraft today. It's literally been a part of my entire career here at the museum. I was here when it arrived after being recovered from Lake Michigan, here when it was unveiled, and it's a pleasure to be able to tell you about its storied history today. It's an SBD-2 Dauntless dive bomber, Bureau number 2106, and today, June 4th, is 78 years to the day since it flew at the Battle of Midway, which I certainly will get into later on in this presentation. But first, I want to tell you what an SBD Dauntless was, and is in this case. SBD stands for Scout Bomber Douglas, and it was an aircraft that was built by Douglas Aircraft Company, designed by a guy named Ed Heineman, who went on to design the A4 Skyhawk, the A3D Sky Warrior, just a notable designer in naval aviation history. And this aircraft is a dive bomber, because let's talk a little bit about how the Navy planned on attacking an enemy ship as they were experimenting with what naval aviation could do in a sea battle. Unlike the Army Air Forces, which focused on high altitude bombing, horizontally bombing stationary targets, you would drop bombs from many thousands of feet in the air, and your target was not going to move. The factory was not going to be moving that you were trying to hit. But in the case of a ship, it's going to be maneuvering, trying to avoid your bomb. So if you're dropping from a high altitude, chances of you actually hitting a ship that's moving are pretty slim. So the Navy developed a tactic called dive bombing, in which the aircraft would actually go generally about 70-degree dives, and the pilot would generally be literally actually aiming his bomb at the ship as it was maneuvering around, and generally would not drop his bomb except merely a few thousand feet above the surface of the water, maybe even less, and that would maximize the chance for the bomb to hit the ship. And it was a very effective tactic against shipping, which was proven by this aircraft in World War II. One of the design features of the Dauntless as a dive bomber were these right here. We actually had one child one day ask us why this aircraft had so many cup holders on it, but these definitely aren't cup holders. These are perforated dive flaps. So when the aircraft went into a dive, they would open up, which would help stabilize the aircraft on its way down to improve accuracy as it was approaching the ship it was bombing. And as we walk around the aircraft here and see its wings, the SBD was known by the nickname Slow But Deadly. It was not a very fast aircraft. It was one that had top speed was about 245 miles an hour, so it wasn't going to outrun much, but as a dive bomber, it was a very effective platform. Now, another aspect of being a dive bomber was this centerline station for dropping bombs. You'll notice it had some wing racks, but the centerline station was where it carried the real bulk of its offensive power. And you'll notice right here, it's a bomb cradle or a bomb crutch, because when this aircraft was going into a dive, they needed to have a situation or a piece of equipment that would swing the bomb away from the fuselage. And so that's what this bomb cradle was for. When the pilot hit the controls to release the bomb, the cradle would swing back and throw the bomb away from the aircraft so it wouldn't go through this propeller right here. This particular Dauntless has a very storied history. It is, as far as its provenance or what it actually did during its service, it is one of the most historic aircraft that we have here in the museum. It was delivered in 1940. It actually arrived in its squadron, Bombing Squadron 2, on the last day of 1940. And when it arrived, it was in the pre-war paint scheme. And the pre-war paint scheme consisted of yellow on the wings. So this aircraft is actually still wearing some of its original paint. And this is an example of that right here, this yellow paint. As I said, delivered in 1940, and it flew with Bombing Squadron 2, which was based on board the USS Lexington. And during most of the period of 1941, it flew with that squadron at sea and also flew it ashore. There were these famous maneuvers in 1941 that took place in Louisiana, wide-ranging maneuvers by the US Army, and this aircraft, as part of VB-2, actually participated in those. And that's where a lot of generals who went on to become famous in World War II made names for themselves in these exercises. People like Eisenhower and Patton, if those names ring a bell. But VB-2 was in the Pacific, and as the aircraft was carrying out its missions leading up into the later part of 1941, it was pretty clear that the Japanese were threatening, in a threatening posture for the United States. So what the US decided to do was to fortify islands to the west of Hawaii, places like Wake and Midway, for example. And in order to do that, they put Marine fighter squadrons on board carriers and flew them out, or transported them out, excuse me, to fly onto these islands so that they could bolster the defenses of these places. Well, when you brought the Marine squadrons on board, it necessitated removing some of the Navy squadrons that were on board the carriers to make room for these new squadrons. So some of the aircraft were pulled off for these missions, which took place in November, early December 1941. And this aircraft was one of them that was pulled off of Lexington, and it was put on Ford Island, which is right smack dab in the middle of Pearl Harbor. So this is where that aircraft was on that fateful Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, when Japanese carrier aircraft staged a surprise attack against Pearl Harbor. So it is a Pearl Harbor survivor. And people did all that they could to try to defend against air attack that day. There was one gentleman who used to come here to the museum quite often named Jim Landis, who was a rear gunner in aircraft like this. And he actually ran to one of the Dauntlesses that was parked, grabbed the defensive machine gun out of the rear cockpit, and attempted to fire against attacking Japanese aircraft. So that was combat action number one for this particular Dauntless. Well, Lexington comes back to port. Luckily, the carrier had been delivering Marine aircraft elsewhere. And when the carrier pulled into port, this aircraft was loaded back aboard. And then it was part of some of the earlier carrier raids of World War II. In the early months of the war, aircraft carriers were used to stage hit and run raids. They would go steam to within the vicinity of a Japanese held island, launch an airstrike, the airstrike would return to the carrier, and the carrier would head out. And so that was what the flat tops were used for early on in the months of 1942. And one such raid was against Japanese shipping in New Guinea. And it involved the USS Lexington and the USS Yorktown launching carrier strikes that flew across the Owen Stanley Mountains and descended toward an anchorage in New Guinea to attack Japanese shipping. And this particular plane, with Lieutenant Junior Grade Mark Whittier as the pilot, and his gunner, Radioman Forrest Stanley, made this attack on March 10th, 1942. And they were credited with hitting a Japanese ship. They actually scored a near miss, but that was the second combat action for this particular airplane. Whittier received the Navy Cross for his action that day, and Forrest Stanley received the Distinguished Flying Cross. And Whittier actually was here at the museum in 2001 when this aircraft was actually completed and unveiled. He actually sat in the same cockpit he had sat in March of 1942, which was a very interesting thing to see. Well, Lexington came back after that raid and got back to Pearl Harbor. And before going out again for the Battle of Coral Sea, where Lexington was actually sunk, Bombing Squadron 2 traded planes. They got upgraded versions of the SBD, and they traded these in and gave them to the Marine Corps. And they were assigned to a squadron called VMSB 241. Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241, and transported to Midway. And VMSB 241 was led by a guy named Major Lofton Henderson, who later went on to become the namesake for Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. And in the squadron were two individuals. One was First Lieutenant Daniel Iverson, who was a native of Miami, Florida, had been to Davidson College, was a basketball player there, went to flight school, and was commissioned in the Marine Corps. He had actually been present at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked. He was at a field called Eva when the Japanese attacked, and was actually there when fighters came strafing across the airfield. So he had seen enemy fire before. His gunner, who would have sat in the rear cockpit here, was a guy named Private First Class Wallace Reed. And he was a native of Oklahoma, but then had moved to Washington State. And he had had a brother in the Marine Corps, and so he was also very focused on his mission as a Marine gunner. Well, on the morning of June 4th, 1942, that was really the main day of the Battle of Midway. And this aircraft was one of 16 aircraft like it that were part of VMSB 241 that launched to attack the Japanese fleet, which consisted of 4 aircraft carriers and numerous escort vessels. And it was a very deadly mission for the squadron. A number of aircraft were shot down. As a matter of fact, of the 16 of these type aircraft in the squadron, only 8 of them returned from the mission. So it was a 50% loss rate. And this Dauntless, with Iverson and Reed in it, was very lucky to get back. They arrived over the target area and they initiated their dive bombing run. And as they were actually making their dive bombing run against a Japanese carrier, Japanese Zero fighters followed them down. And in addition to the anti-aircraft fire coming from the ships, the fighters were firing at them on their way down. And when Iverson dropped his bomb, which it unfortunately missed, he pulled out and tried to get away from the enemy as fast as he could, but the Japanese kept pursuing him. The fighters kept following him. And before it was all said and done, there were 219 some odd bullet holes that were put in the aircraft. Wallace Reed in the rear cockpit here, you can see the gunner is not very well protected here, very exposed to enemy fire. He was actually wounded. Iverson had a bullet probably come as close as you possibly could without getting hit. Aviators at that time wore these throat microphone cords, and there was a bullet that came so close that it clipped the cord, and he was very, very fortunate not to be seriously wounded, if not killed, by that enemy fire. So on the way back, 219 bullet holes, and as you see right here, during the restoration, the patches that actually covered those bullet holes when this aircraft was repaired, they are still visible here on the aircraft. Iverson made it back to Midway. He had the hydraulics shot out. He could only get one of his landing gear down, and he made a landing at Midway. But it was essentially the end of the flying days for this aircraft during that battle. And fortunately for us, there was a photographer that snapped some photographs of the battle damage, which you can really see clearly the level of damage that was done to this particular aircraft by the Japanese. Well, this was the third combat action. Iverson received the Navy Cross for his mission, and Wallace Reed received the Distinguished Flying Cross. So you have 3 combat actions, 2 of which resulted in the pilot receiving the Navy Cross, which later on in the war became the second highest medal for decoration for heroism, right below the Medal of Honor. The 2 members of the crew went on after Midway and flew later on in World War II. There was sort of a tragic story associated with them. Iverson went on to fly at Guadalcanal, which was a very famous battle later on. He was wounded at Guadalcanal, and he ultimately was a flight instructor at Naval Air Station Vero Beach, Florida, where he was tragically killed in a mid-air collision in 1944. The gunner, Wallace Reed, served in combat throughout the rest of World War II, ended up receiving a commission in the Marine Corps as a lieutenant, and was in Korea, and he was tragically killed on the Pusan perimeter in 1950, in the early weeks of the Korean War. So the crew that flew it into history did not live to see the aircraft placed on display in 2001. Only Mark Whittier, of the 4 who flew it in combat, remained alive after 1950. The others were all killed either in World War II or Korea. But who was here when the aircraft was unveiled were the children of Lieutenant Iverson and also Wallace Reed, and they too were able to sit in the cockpits where their fathers had sat during this aircraft's operational service. Now, as for the aircraft, it actually continued to fly, but not in combat. It was sent to Naval Air Station Glenview, Illinois, and that's where the airplane was used to qualify prospective carrier pilots on the 2 Great Lakes training aircraft carriers that operated there. In June of 1943, a little over a year after it flew at the Battle of Midway, it was being flown by a Marine lieutenant named Donald Douglas. And he had to ditch the aircraft during flight operations during an attempted carrier landing there in Lake Michigan. And he got out of the airplane, but it did not survive. It sank to the bottom of Lake Michigan, and it was from that location that it was recovered in 1994. And it took 7 years to restore it to its appearance right now. But the history for this aircraft, what makes it so neat to me is history always seems to find it. And what I mean by that is after its unveiling, we got a call in around 2013, and it was from a Navy test pilot who was on his way to Pax River, Maryland, and he brought with him a logbook that belonged to his grandfather. And his grandfather's name was Charles Romer. The officer was Lieutenant Tyler Hurst, and he told us that his grandfather had been the last person to fly this aircraft the day before it was ditched in Lake Michigan. And so we have a copy of his logbook page that shows him making really what amounted to the final landing for this aircraft, the final successful landing of the airplane. And just this past September 2019, we had a change of command ceremony here in the museum, and assuming command of a new destroyer was a commander named Dan Hancock. And he wanted to have his change of command here, or assumption of command, here in the museum. And it's not often that a destroyer commanding officer wants to have that momentous occasion take place in a museum devoted to naval aviation. But one reason he did is because of his name, Daniel Hancock. Daniel is his great uncle's name, and that great uncle was Daniel Iverson, who flew this airplane. So Commander Hancock was able to stand right up here on the wing, on the same wing that his great uncle had stood on right before the Battle of Midway. And just not too long ago, we also received a neat donation that was a watch. And it was purchased in Central Florida at an estate sale. And the watch on the reverse side said, to Captain Iverson from the Hospital Corpsmen, remember Pearl Harbor. And Daniel Iverson had been wounded at Guadalcanal, so we surmised that this was a gift to him from the Hospital Corpsmen that took care of him. So the history of this aircraft always seems to come alive, no matter how long it's been since it flew at Midway, and no matter how long it's been since it was placed on display here. But with its combat history, it is one of the most historic aircraft in naval aviation. And on this particular day, 78 years ago, it flew at the Battle of Midway, and it is the only known surviving aircraft to have participated in one of the most momentous engagements in naval history. So I thank you very much for taking the time to spend with us this morning and learn about the SBD Dauntless, and I am happy to take your questions about the aircraft's history and any other questions you might have about naval aviation during this time frame. Well, thank you for that kind.
Presentation on the Dauntless. We do have a few questions, and the first one comes from Casey. Did this particular Dauntless achieve a hit on the Japanese carrier at the Battle of Midway?
Actually, this one, unfortunately, they did not achieve a hit. They attacked the Japanese carrier Hiryu, but they were unable to score a hit.
Roy says, what carrier did this aircraft fly off of?
Well, this one flew from land, flew from Midway Atoll, but the aircraft like this, SBD Dauntlesses, flew from all three aircraft carriers at the Battle of Midway, USS Enterprise, USS Yorktown, and USS Hornet. And although Hornet's Dauntlesses did not attack the Japanese fleet, The ones from Enterprise and Yorktown were the aircraft that were solely responsible for sinking all 4 Japanese aircraft carriers.
Jose asks, is that the original color combination? Are there any recent videos made so one can hear the engine sound?
Well, as far as the color scheme of the aircraft, we tried to match what the aircraft would have been, or how it would have been painted at the Battle of Midway. And as some of the photos that you saw during the presentation show, we had a pretty good idea. It's a 2-tone paint scheme that was on aircraft during that particular time. As far as the sound of the engine, I think there are some videos out there that I've seen that were filmed, particularly on board the USS Enterprise before World War II, showing where you can hear the engine noise. But you're sure to find some out there that captured what this aircraft sounded like when it was in operation.
So the next question comes from Greg Miller, and he says, is it true that the Dauntless destroyed more Japanese shipping than any other American plane?
I've read many accounts that say that. I haven't really looked at the stats to show it, but certainly when it comes to tonnage, if not in number, the Dauntless was incredibly potent and was very responsible for destroying a high amount of tonnage of Japanese shipping. Because if you think about it, the Dauntless flew at pretty much all 5 of the major carrier versus carrier engagements during World War II and all throughout the Solomon Islands campaign, and really served throughout World War II, even though the aircraft that was supposed to replace it, the SB-2C Helldiver, came into service. So the Dauntless was that effective.
So we have another question, and it comes from Mr. Brian Whitworth, and he says, I'd like to ask about the pilot's scope with relation to the many reports of it fogging up during dives. Was this condition not tested or known about prior to the early carrier raids in New Guinea?
As far as the telescopic sight or bomb sight, you can see it in the cockpit of the Dauntless. It is mainly inside the canopy, and then it pokes out the front. And pilots did note from the early engagements that when the aircraft reached an altitude coming from high altitude where it started its dive until it reached around roughly 7,000 feet or so, that's when they started to note that it started to fog over, in addition to not only the telescopic sight, but also the canopy itself sometimes would fog over. So one thing they decided to try to do was to maybe initiate their dives at a lower altitude if possible. And another thing, they applied a special coating that it tried to prevent it from fogging over. But as far as them knowing about it, I never have seen anything in the pilot handbooks that indicated that, and it may have been a surprise in the fact that they were operating in climates that they really hadn't routinely operated in earlier on. So probably was a surprise, but eventually in the SBD-5 Dauntless, they put a different sight that was entirely contained inside the cockpit, and that made things a lot better.
So Bruce says, I have heard that Bureau number 2111 is even more historically significant than 2106. I can't find any records on it, though. Do you have any comments or have any knowledge about this?
Well, Bureau number 2111 was a Dauntless that was also in the same squadron, VMSB 241, and it was flown by a guy named Captain Richard Fleming. And Dick Fleming flew his aircraft, his Dauntless, just right alongside Daniel Iverson to attack the Japanese carriers. His aircraft, I believe, had almost 200 bullet holes in it when it came back. And what made Fleming really notable was the fact that later on in the battle, he flew an SB-2U Vindicator of the type we have here in the museum, and actually received the Medal of Honor posthumously for that mission. So if 2111 had been recovered, it certainly would have had a tremendous history associated with it, especially being flown by a Medal of Honor recipient.
So the next question comes from Jeff Woodard, and he says, were there any features of the old SBC carried over into the SBD?
That's a good question. I am not certain of the answer to that. They were different manufacturers. The SBC would have been built by Curtiss Wright, and the Dauntless was by Douglas. One aircraft I do know that influenced the Dauntless was an aircraft called the Northrop BT, which was a monoplane, and it was one of the ones that featured these perforated dive flaps that you see right here. So that was probably the aircraft that influenced the design of the Dauntless the most. But what you can say is all the aircraft that were previously used in the dive bombing role, as far as developing that tactic, they all contributed to.
In the Midway action, was this plane one of the glide bombers, or was the pilot trained for actual dive bombing?
That's a good question. There are a lot of members of VMSB 241 were relatively junior officers, not very experienced second lieutenants. In the case of Daniel Iverson, he was a first lieutenant. He was a little bit more experienced, and I believe, as according to his action report that he filed, it was more of a dive bombing run than a glide bombing run. And of course, with the glide bombing, you couldn't be as accurate as you could be. The more vertical you went, the more accurate you were generally going to be.
Samia says, how did they communicate, the pilot and the passenger? Were there two in this plane?
They had a intercom system on these aircraft, so they could talk back and forth between the respective cockpits.
Robert asked about the restoration of this aircraft here at the museum, and he says, how extensive was the restoration? Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. The restoration the aircraft was recovered in '94 and was not unveiled until 2001. So that gives you a sense of the grand scope of it. And our restoration folks, who you'll hear from in one of these future Facebook Live broadcasts, they're true artisans. And when they take an aircraft to restore, they will remove every component and attempt to clean, restore, do whatever, put non-corrosive material on it and return it to the aircraft. In some cases they have to fabricate things, but what really is a true testament to their professionalism is the fact that they were able to maintain the bullet hole patches that were shown earlier, it really capturing the history of this airplane.
So we have time for one more question, and it comes from Scott Ramsey, and it says, is there a raft on board in case of ditching? And I'll actually add to that too, was there any sort of ejection equipment?
The aircraft at this era did not have ejection seats, but they did have a raft. There's actually a raft compartment, which is right here. So when the pilot ditched the airplane, they would climb out on the wing and they could open this hatch here and pull the life raft. And as a matter of fact, when this one was recovered from Lake Michigan, the life raft was still in it. And we actually have it here in the museum as part of our collection. And so and that's a key thing on a naval aircraft, really. If you look at, they operate mainly from over water, operating from carriers and everything. So it's having a life raft that is a key component of any naval aircraft.
Thank you folks so much for joining us today for our History Up Close Facebook Live presentation. Next week, we have aircraft restoration behind the scenes with a few of our museum representatives out in the hangar. That's Thursday, June 11th at 11 a.m. Central Time, and it is a presentation you will not want to miss. Thanks for everyone joining us, and have a great day.